Hello and welcome to the Ruby on Rails tutorial. I'm Michael Hartle, the author of the Ruby on Rails tutorial book and your host for these screencasts. This is the first screencast called From Zero to Deploy. And in this context, zero means starting with a computer that isn't configured with Ruby or Rails or any of the other software you need to develop Rails applications. And by the end, you should be able to deploy an application to a production server. Now, there are a lot of steps needed to configure a system to run Rails, and unfortunately they depend on the particulars of your system, not only the operating system, such as OS X, Windows, or Linux, but also on the particular version, so the version of OS X or the distribution of Linux that you're using. So I'm going to punt those questions over to the Rails tutorial book. You can find the Rails tutorial book for sale, or it's available online at railstutorial.org/book. So at this point, what you should do is, if you haven't already, go to the Rails tutorial book and follow the first chapter as far as you can. In particular, you should probably try to get through the whole thing, or at least up to the section that says the first application, where I type Rails new first app, which is where I'm going to start in this screencast series. You should also look on the Rails tutorial website for some free screencasts on installation and configuration. But from here on out, I'm going to assume that you've at least configured your system with Ruby and with Rails, and that you're ready to get started. The Rails tutorial screencast series isn't just a tutorial on Rails, it's a tutorial on web development with Rails. So what that means is that we're going to be covering a lot more than just the core Rails functionality. We're going to be talking about the other things you need to know about to make web applications, and that'll include a couple of things that we're going to cover in this lesson, including version control and deploying to a production server. One of the things that you'll learn about as a side effect of the approach I'm taking is my particular development environment and style. So I like to use a terminal window here for issuing commands and a text editor for editing the Rails application itself. There are a lot of different ways to develop Rails applications, though. Your approach will depend on your personal preferences and on the particular platform that you run. Among other things, I'm going to be taking a very Unix-centric approach, so a lot of the commands I'll be issuing have to do with the particular way that Unix operating systems run. If you're running OS X or Linux, these commands should work for you. But if you're running Windows, depending on your setup, they might not work right out of the box. So you'll have to look around to find the Windows equivalents of many of the commands I'm issuing. Another possibility, which actually quite a lot of Windows users have recommended, is to install a virtual machine and install Linux on that virtual machine and do the Rails development in Linux. So there are a lot of different options, but what you'll be seeing in this screencast series is tailored to my particular way of developing software. I remember when I was getting started with web development, the thrill that I felt the first time I ever deployed code to a live server that was accessible to the outside world. So we're going to get started with that right now. We're actually going to create what I like to call the null app, just an application that doesn't do anything. And we're going to put it out into the world so that anyone in principle could view it. The way we're going to get started is at the command line. We're going to create a new directory, if you haven't, called Rails_projects. I've already created it, so I'm just going to cd into it. And now I'm going to use the Rails command. And I'm going to say Rails new and then the name of the application. In this case, first app. Now, the convention for Rails application names is to use what's sometimes called snake case, which is words separated by underscores, all lowercase. Now at the bottom here, you can see that there's a command being run at the end of all these files being created. It says run bundle install. This is running a program called Bundler that installs the software needed to run the default Rails application. We're actually going to change that software as soon as we have a chance to cd into the directory and edit the relevant file. So let's go into the new directory. It's called first app. Let's take a quick look at what that Rails command did for us. I'm going to use open dot here. Open is an OS 10 command that opens files or directories using the proper default application, and here dot is just the current directory. So we can open it up here, and this is what happens when you run the Rails command. What you get is this set of default directories and files. So there's an app directory for the application itself. There's a config directory for application configuration, DB for database, documentation, libraries, logs, and so on. There are a lot of different files and directories here. This was actually one of the big innovations when Rails first came out, that the creation of a standard directory structure, turns out, is really useful, especially if you look at an application that already exists. Even if you didn't write it, you're immediately oriented. So this is a really useful convention to have all of these default directories and files. We're not going to talk much more about these right now, but this is something that we will cover throughout the rest of the tutorial. Pretty much everything here will get coverage at some point. So now I'm going to change over to the editor that I'll be using in the Rails tutorial screencast. This is, as you can see at the top here, called Sublime Text 2. There was an original Sublime Text, and this is its successor. I'll usually just call it Sublime Text, or sometimes just Sublime. It has a lot of great features, and go to the Rails tutorial website for a free screencast on how to use Sublime Text with assorted tricks for to get the most out of it for Rails development, especially. What we're going to do right now is edit the default file that has all of the software needed to run this application, which is called the gem file. So I'm going to open it up. Now, rather than just copying what I'm about to put in, you should go to the Rails tutorial website and use the latest version of the gem file, because these version numbers might have changed. All right, so this is a stripped down version of the gem file. I saved it, and now I'm going to type bundle install. Now that ran really quickly because pretty much all of the software is already installed as part of the original Rails new command. But this just guarantees that I'm using the correct version of all the software used in the Rails tutorial. Of course, it's a lot easier to update a book than it is to update screencasts, which is why I recommend going with the latest version on the Rails tutorial website. All right, let's close down the gem file. And now I'm going to go over to the second tab here, and I'm going to cd into the directory. And I'm going to run a local web server. I'm going to type Rails server. And what this does is runs a web server. This is really useful to be able to run the application and see what it's doing. So let's take a look here. I have Chrome configured so that the home page is localhost 3000, which is the default location for the Rails server. So let's just hit return here. And here we go. Welcome aboard, you're writing Ruby on Rails. This is the default Rails homepage. It's not very exciting, of course, and later on in this tutorial we'll be replacing it. But for now, it's really nice to see that we actually have something running. And you can even click on this about your application's environment. It gives you some detail about the local Rails environment. Now, your details here might differ. That's not anything to worry about, but it's nice to have a sense of actually having something work. All right, let's go back to the first app here, having installed the right software and just verify that we can get something running locally. Now what we're going to do is put our source code under version control. If you're new to version control, I recommend going to the Rails tutorial book and reading a little more about it. The basic idea is that version control gives us a way to track the changes in the files and directories of our application. It means, among other things, that we can roll back if we make mistakes, and we can also document our development process. In the context of this lesson, version control is particularly important because the deployment solution we're going to be using, which is called Heroku, requires that we have our source code under version control, and not just any version control. We have to use a version control system called Git. You can find details on installing and configuring Git in the Rails tutorial book. I'm going to assume that you've gone through those steps at this point, and we're just going to get started with the actual setup for the first app. Now, one thing you might notice right away is that if you list the files in the directory, let's do -A to list them all, you see that there's a file here called .gitignore. This is a file that tells Git which files and directories you shouldn't put under version control. So let's take a look at it. You can see here that the gitignore ignores the bundler configuration, also the local SQLite database, and also log files and temp directory. So this is a really useful file. If you've used Git before and have some familiarity with this file, there's something that ought to surprise you, which is that this exists already. How did Rails know? This is not something that normally happens. You would ordinarily have to create your own .gitignore file. And what's going on here is that the adoption of Git in the Rails community has been so strong that Rails simply assumes that you're very likely to want to use Git and gives you a nice default .gitignore. There are a couple things I want to add. In particular, in this case, I want to add something here called dsstore. And in fact, we can take a look at this here. Right here, when I did ls-a, there's this dsstore. I don't even know what this does, but what I do know is that this file gets placed in a directory by the OS X finder. So when I did open dot, it created that dsstore. So I do not want to version that. That's not part of the application. So we're going to add that to the .gitignore file. All right, that looks good. And now we're going to run git init. This initializes the current directory as a Git repository. The next step is to add all the files in the current directory, which we do with git add. And then we want to say everything in the current directory, so we're going to use the dot. And we can check to see what we just did by typing git status. You can see there are a bunch of new files added. So now we're going to commit these files. Give it a message, initial commit. And there we go. We've now added all our files to version control. And we can take a look at what we just did by typing git log. There we go. Initial commit. Now, you might wonder at this point what exactly Git does for you. There are a lot of things that come from using version control, but one of them is it lets you recover from potentially serious errors. So, for example, I'm going to list the app controllers directory here. And you can see there's one file there. Suppose we were to remove that accidentally. I'm just going to remove that directory. R here is recursive, and F is force. So it's just going to remove everything there. You can see that now there's no such file directory. Now suppose that I wasn't happy about this. I could type git status and see that there are some changes that I've made. I deleted this file in the directory as well. And suppose that I wanted to recover from this. There are several ways to do this. The one that I can always remember is git checkout and then -f for force. What this does is undoes all of the changes that we just made. Actually, that might not have done it. Let's take a look. Git status. Yeah, that did work. Sometimes you have to do git add in order to add the changes, and then you can get rid of them using git checkout -f. One of the great things about putting your source code under version control with Git is that you can share your code with collaborators or potentially with the rest of the world using the site GitHub. So if you haven't already signed up for GitHub, you should do that at this point. It's at github.com. Here is the page for creating a new repository at GitHub. In order to get to this stage, you have to do quite a bit of configuration on your local system. So just go through the GitHub sign up procedure if you haven't and follow their instructions. They have a lot of really good educational materials at GitHub. So if you haven't gone through that, do that now and then come back to this point where you can start a new repository at this page. So let's put in our project name. We're going to call it First App, just in parallel with the name we've already used. And we can describe it. And we don't need to give it a homepage URL. Down here, we say who has access to this repository. And there's no reason not to share this with everyone, so I'm just going to say that anyone can look at this. One of the cool things about GitHub is that public repositories are free. And so that's great for open source projects. A lot of open source projects use GitHub, including, among others, Ruby on Rails itself. All right, we've created the repository, and now you can see that GitHub gives us a lot of instructions about what we do next. But we've already got an existing repository. You can see here, existing Git repo. Yes, that's what we have. So let's look at the instructions here. It says git remote add origin, and then it has the address git@github.com:mhartle/firstapp.git. So let's do this. And I'm going to copy this here. Actually, let's type that in. This is git push-u origin master. If you're interested about this -u, go ahead and do a web search on git set upstream. Push-u origin. In this context, origin is GitHub. We just configured GitHub to be the origin. And master is the name of the particular branch of code that we're on. We'll be talking about that later in this lesson. So what this does is it pushes our code up to GitHub. So if we go to GitHub now, we should be able to see that code. It says when you're done, continue. So let's click on this. And here we go. Repository was successfully created. And if you look back at the directory structure of our First App repository, it's now mirrored here. So here's app. You can click on it and see the app directory, and so on. You can see our gitignore file. You can see the .ds store we added. And let's just scroll down though. You can see that there's a readme.rdoc. So rdoc is a format. It's the long version is RubyDoc. If you look at this README, you can see that it says "Welcome to Rails." Now, there's something about that. If you think about this, this is our application. This isn't Rails itself. So this is not a very useful README file for our application. So what we're going to do before deploying this to a production server is make a change into our README file to make it something that's specialized to what our application actually does. So this is a relatively easy change. It's really almost trivial. And because it's so easy, it's a nice opportunity to do something new. So what we're going to do here is practice a workflow that is really useful in version control, especially with Git. It involves making essentially a copy of our code base, making changes on the copy so that the original copy isn't affected. And then when we're convinced that we're done making our changes, we can merge those changes back into the main copy. So the main copy is called master. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new branch. In this case, we're going to call it modify readme. And we can make a new branch by using git checkout and then the -b flag, which is for branch, and then the name of the branch. And you can see that I have my prompt configured to show you the actual branch, which is nice. This is convenient. If you do some web searches on git bash and maybe a branch name, you should be able to find out how to do this. Exactly how to do it depends on your system, so I don't want to go through the details right now, but this is a convenient thing to have. And certainly for the purposes of this tutorial, it's nice from a pedagogical point of view to be able to see the branch name. Now, I mentioned that we're essentially working on a copy of the source code. Of course, Git isn't that stupid. It's not going to make a full copy of all of our files. It's doing something a lot smarter under the hood. I recommend a book called Pro-Git by Scott Chacon if you're interested in learning more about that. Among other things, Pro-Git is available for free online at progit.org. All right, so that was our branch step. Now let's make an edit. The first thing I'm going to do is change the name of the file. You can see that it's readme.rdoc. That rdoc format, though, is not my preferred format. I prefer to use a formatting language called Markdown. So I'm going to move that file using the mv command. But there's an even better way to do this. You can do git mv. And what this does is tells Git that I'm changing the name of the file. So Git will know that it's the same file, just that its name has changed. If I typed mv without typing Git, then Git would think that I deleted one file and added a new file. There we go. One of the things you may have noticed at GitHub is that it formatted this rdoc nicely. You can see here it has nice formatting. That's because GitHub recognizes from the extension here that it's an rdoc file and formats it nicely. And it will do the same thing with this .md file extension. So let's take a look at this thing. Go to our editor. And I'm going to use the pound sign, which is the top level heading, and say Ruby on Rails tutorial. The first application. Here I'm using asterisks, which Markdown interprets as emphasis or italics. And these square brackets indicate the name of a link, and then I put the URL of the link here in parentheses. And notice that Sublime Text did some syntax highlighting here because it knows from the .md that this is a Markdown file, and so it knows that this is something it should highlight. By Michael Hartle. Do this, and here's my home page. I like to put the trailing slash. You don't need it, but I don't know, it gives me a clean feeling. All right, let's save that file. So I've made this change. Now let's take a look at the status. You can see that Git knows that we renamed the file from readme.rdoc to readme.md, and then it also knows that we've modified that file. So let's commit those changes. Now, you might see here that it says changes not staged for commit. We need to tell Git that we're ready to actually commit these changes. We could add that file. Remember before we did git add dot? We could do this. This would work. But there's a more compact way to do that if you want to commit all the changes that have been made, which we do right now. We can do this. We can do a -a flag for all, and then we'll give it a message with the M flag. Improve the README file. This is a style that has become commonplace in the Git world to use present tense for commit. So improve, not improved, but improve. And the Rails tutorial book has a link to a GitHub post on the motivation for that decision. Okay, so we've now told Git about our change. But this change is on this branch, this modify README branch. So what we want to do now is check out the master branch. And now we're going to merge those changes in. We're going to apply the change to the README file to the source code in the master branch. Let's take a look at the README file. In fact, if I click over here, this just changed in in Sublime, it went from a little X to a dot. That means the file's been modified. So if Sublime is saying, hey, I don't know about this file, I'm going to say don't save. That's okay. We'll get rid of that change. So let's open the README file. You can see that there's no file called readme.md. There's only readme.rdoc. That's because we haven't yet applied the changes made on the other branch. So let's go here, and the command to apply those changes is git merge, and then the name of the branch. There we go. Git merge modify readme. You can see a summary of the changes. And at this point, since we're done with this branch, we can remove it with git branch -d for delete, and then the name of the branch. Okay. Oftentimes you'll want to keep a branch around if you're going to be making changes on it and merging them into master. But at this point, we're done. And ordinarily, I wouldn't use a branch for something as simple as this, but when learning something new, it's nice to have only one thing be difficult. So here what's hard is the branch and merge workflow. All right, at this point, we've made our changes, and we're ready to push the code up to GitHub. The way we do this is with the git push command. Before we did git push -u origin master, after doing that once, we don't have to specify the location, which is origin, or the branch, which is master. Let's git push. There we go. And now let's take a look at our GitHub page again. Let's reload it. And there we go. Now instead of readme.rdoc, we have readme.md, and GitHub formats it nicely using the Markdown formatting language. And we can just take a look at it here, just to remind ourselves. Oh, it actually formats it here, doesn't it? We can look at raw. There we go, to see what the actual code looks like. Markdown is a really nice, lightweight formatting language. I have a strong preference for it. In fact, it's so nice, a lot of people use it to write books, and it's not well suited to that. It's not good for long documents because it's essentially just HTML. But for little documents like this, it's really nice. All right, so now we've got our source code under version control. We pushed it up to GitHub. Now we're ready to deploy it to a production server. The way we're going to do that is to use Heroku. If you don't already have a Heroku account, you should go to heroku.com and create one, and then also go through the steps needed to configure your system to be able to push code up to Heroku. Of course, I've already done those steps. So I will show you one step you need to do. Gem install Heroku is something that you'll definitely have to do if you haven't done it. So at this point, if you're just following along and you haven't actually followed the steps at Heroku, it's not going to work. So you really have to go to Heroku and go through their full sign-up procedure. But at this point, my system is properly configured for pushing up to Heroku. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to do Heroku create, and I'm going to use a particular, what's called a stack. This is the latest version of the Heroku hosting platform. It's called Cedar. What this does is create a remote application for deployment. Now, if you look at the URL here, it says morningwaterfall1682.herokuapp.com. So this is the URL for our new application. Let's see what's up there right now. Heroku, welcome to your new app. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's nothing here because we haven't pushed up our code yet. But this just goes to show that there is in fact a live URL on the web that is prepared for our application code. So having created the remote application, now we need to push our code up to Heroku so Heroku can run it. The way we do that is by pushing up to Heroku. Now, you may remember that before we did git push origin master, and in that case we had specifically configured our system to consider origin to be GitHub. In this case, you may wonder, how does our system know about this remote Heroku repository? And the answer is it comes for free as part of Heroku Create. So if you look at this here, this is exactly the address we need in order to push our code up to Heroku. And in this case, since it's the first push, we want to tell it the branch, which in this case is the master branch. In fact, at Heroku, you have to push up the master branch. All right, that took a while on my system, so I skipped ahead a little bit. It will probably take longer than you just saw. But at this point, our code should be up at Heroku. Let's take a look. Let's reload this. And there we are. Welcome aboard, you're writing Ruby on Rails. Incidentally, if you click this link here about your application's environment, you'll get an error message. This is just because of the way that the default Rails page interacts with the Heroku setup. It doesn't work exactly the same way as the local server. So don't worry about this error message. Even though the book explicitly says don't worry about it, I still get the occasional email saying, hey, I clicked on the link and it didn't work. But it's okay. This is expected behavior at Heroku. So let's recap what we did in this lesson. We were able to create a new Rails application, put the source code under version control, push it up to GitHub so that we could share our code with other people or potential collaborators, and we deployed the application to a production server. Now, of course, we haven't actually learned anything about Ruby on Rails web development at this point, but what we've accomplished is incredibly difficult. So many things have to go right in order to be able to do everything we've done. In particular, if you've never put a web application on the live web before, well, now you have. This is it. This is running on the live web. It's not very exciting right now, but this is a huge accomplishment. And even a few years ago, it would have been almost impossible to get to this stage so early in the game. Looking ahead over the next several lessons, we're going to create a demonstration application or a demo app that will be a full-fledged database-backed web application. And as in this lesson, we're going to deploy it to a live server. And then we'll get started on the main sample application for the Rails tutorial called Sample App. And starting in lesson 3, we will start developing for real. The next lesson is still just a demo, but starting in lesson 3, we're going to be developing an application pretty much the way you would as a full-strength industrial web application intended for a full deployment. So let's get started.